a couple of minutes. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the ISES Leadership Conference Series. This is Chakravarti Ravapragada from the ISES executive team. Really excited to invite you to this final day series of this leadership conference, which has been hosted by Indo-American Community Services. It's been spread out for the past 3 Fridays, and I think this is our third one. And as a part of this, today we have an exciting series which is going on. But one is with the current one is the future of work. Just to give a background of Indo-American Community Services, we are a mission to increase diversity at workplaces and provide a leadership networking platform. ISES hosts annual conferences, entrepreneur conferences, women's leadership events, virtual career expos, young leaders program, student internship programs, young leader programs, and mentoring programs to foster leadership and making sure that we bring in the best out of everybody. So coming back to this conference series theme, it's our new normal. So as a part of this new normal CD theme, today's topic is future of work and how to avoid pitfalls in the new normal. So we are today we're going to welcome our esteemed speaker, Bonnie Dolling. She's an associate partner at McKinsey. Has a fantastic experience around some of the hybrid virtual operating models, employee engagement, capability building, leadership development, labor optimization, many more. I think very interesting stuff. So we're really excited to hear about her interesting findings, suggestions on how we're going to work in the new future, because it's the most critical item today in our minds at this time. So before we hand it off to Bonnie, just wanted to make sure that if you have any questions, please put in your questions in the chat and or the Q&A sessions. So please go ahead and put in your questions so we can take it up at the end of the session. So over to you, Bonnie. Please go ahead. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you all for having me here and inviting me. As Chatra said, my focus has been on learning, leadership development, end-to-end talent development, the whole spectrum within the org space at McKinsey. But for the past year, my focus has truly pivoted to be really on actually supporting clients as they actually think through or rethink and reimagine not only where they're working, but how they're working. And so I've had conversations with over 200 clients all over the world, from South America to Australia to Asia to plenty right here in the US. I am based in Colorado, for what that's worth. Anyway, I'm going to jump in, and what I thought we would talk about today is the pitfalls. So as we think about the future of work, what are some of the things we want to avoid and how we can avoid them? I'll try to be really tactical as well, so that when you walk away from this, you can have some things you can start doing with your organizations tomorrow even. So with that, let me share my screen. Here we go. So when we think about pitfalls, there are kind of 5 that I would want to highlight. There's avoiding communicating a plan until you have perfect clarity. I'm going to do a deep dive on each one of these, but so many organizations today are thinking about how they're going to change, but they haven't communicated anything to their employees. So we're going to spend a little time talking about that and what you can communicate and what the implications are of not communicating as well. Assuming that we can go back to the way things were. This is a little bit of the toothpaste in the tube kind of theory here. The toothpaste is now out of the tube. So the idea that we could go back to 5 days a week in the office is probably unrealistic. Developing a one-size-fits-all solution or allowing ultimate flexibility for all. So these are sort of the two different ends of the spectrum, if you will. And then finally, thinking that what got us here will get us there. So thinking that because things have worked for the past year, maybe we don't need to make changes and we can kind of continue to move forward. So with that, we'll start getting into them. So the issue of communication, as I mentioned, you've probably seen many announcements lately. You've probably seen things from Spotify or from Google or others as to how they're thinking about what that next normal could look like, thinking about hybrid virtual models. But for all of those that have communicated something, over 68% of their employees in a recent survey said they either hadn't heard anything or they weren't really clear on what was communicated. And that's in part because many of even those big announcements may not actually be specific. So saying that you want to pursue a hybrid virtual model doesn't necessarily alleviate anxiety, which is really happening. So 46% of respondents to that survey found that not knowing what was going to happen was causing real concern and anxiety, which is really important to think about, knowing that we are now at this point in the pandemic, employees are 3 times more likely to rate their mental health as very poor. We're exhibiting huge signs of burnout as a workforce. So anything that we can do to start alleviating some of that stress is going to be really important. And so what can we do with comms? It's totally understandable that people are concerned about communicating anything or boxing themselves in or making a commitment when they don't really know, which is the stage that many companies are at right now. They will say things like, well, we know it'll probably be hybrid, but we don't know what that looks like. And how can we tell people when they're going to come back when we don't know, because things are changing with vaccines and everything else? And those are all very fair points, but there are things that you can do. So you can use that change management lens. So how are you actually going to inspire people in this moment? How can you set an aspiration? And so when I say set an aspiration, if you've come to a point where you know that you want something like a hybrid model, or even if you know that what you want is more heavily back into the office, how can you position that and communicate it in such a way that is inspiring your workforce and helping them think about what this next normal could look like and how you're going to go into it together? Don't be shy about sharing that the plan is evolving and that you want to evolve it with them, right? So the more that you can bring in your workforce at this point, the better off you'll be. You want to be understanding what they want, and you want to be using that to inform plans, and they're going to be receptive to it generally. But finally, can you provide any time-bounded clarity, which will allow your employees to plan? And so this is one of the big items, especially for parents, and especially knowing that many people have moved away from the location of their office, often for childcare reasons, but could be for others as well. If you can provide some level of clarity in terms of when they will be required to come back to the office, that's really helpful. Before you say, but we don't know, what you do know is the point at which they will not be required, right? So you can say something like, no one who is currently working in a virtual model will be required to return to the office prior to Labor Day, if you're in the US. So what that does is it allows people to plan until Labor Day. You can always push it out further, but you've given them something so they're not actually changing plans every month or always kind of on edge, worried about whether or not they're going to be called back in on Monday. So just thinking about how you can start getting ahead of the communications instead of waiting until you have a perfect answer is really key. And on what you're communicating. So there are organizations and there are people who assume that when this is over, we're all going to go back and it's going to be 5 days a week in the office, just like the good old days pre-pandemic. We'll go back to wearing our suits and ties and being in conference rooms and the like. it's unlikely that that is going to happen. And I say that because we know that the number one request from men and women alike prior to the pandemic, so this is from 2019, was for increased work-life flexibility. So it's something that people have been asking for a while. What the pandemic did was it showed that we can actually have more flexibility and it still works. So putting that toothpaste back in the tube, like I said, is going to be really difficult. In fact, in a recent survey, we found that 29% of surveyed employees said they would actually consider leaving. And that has been, I've seen that from multiple studies, from multiple organizations, that put it right at about a third of your workforce. So if you think about how competitive the world is right now for top talent, knowing that you're risking losing a third of your workforce is something to really think about. And people really are asking for that flexibility. So what you see at the bottom of the page in this graph is actually showing you that when asked how often they would prefer to work from home, globally, about 83% of people wanted to work at least one day. We also asked C-suite executives and said, what do you imagine your post-pandemic model will look like? And will you be offering flexibility? And 90% said that they imagined that at least one day a week would be flexible to work from home. So, and it varies, obviously, there's more days, but the reality is most people will be offering increased flexibility when we get back. So something to consider. However, just knowing that isn't really enough. You also have to start preparing for it, right? And so what are you going to do to actually get ahead of that and start to make those decisions? How are you going to develop your managers? Because truly, it takes a different skill set to manage in a virtual environment or in a hybrid environment than what it took to manage in person. When we think about culture, which we know is such a huge part of employee engagement, as well as our organizational health, we have to be much more deliberate when it comes to a hybrid virtual environment. So things that you took for granted, those water cooler conversations, passing each other in the hallways, seeing each other in cubicles on the floor or at lunch, those things don't happen without being quite deliberate about them if you're in a virtual context. So thinking through ways to do that is really important. As you move into a hybrid environment, and this is one of the things that's actually really different from the environment we're working in now, where most people are actually virtual, you risk creating uneven playing fields. You risk creating two separate cultures. And so you have to be very conscious about how you're going to address that. One of the things I like to share with clients is we've spent a long time as kind of an executive and leadership community in thinking about unconscious bias. We think about it on gender, we think about it on ethnicity and race. When we start to bring working models into play, we're actually bringing another lens into that as well. So it's recency bias is what we call it. But if you saw someone on site, then you're more likely to recommend them for the promotion or the big opportunity than the employee that's working virtually if you're on a different schedule and you haven't seen them. So thinking about ways that you can actually start measuring and tracking, and you can get ahead of that and see if anything is happening and make managers aware too. Like, oh, it's ratings time, it's reviews, and it looks like those that you are on the same schedule with, you're rating higher than those that aren't. Is that accurate? Or is that something that you kind of need to think about the biases that may be coming into play there? Actively managing social cohesion. So this is another piece. It kind of plays into that be deliberate about your culture, but actually thinking about ways that you can build social cohesion amongst people. And that oftentimes is going to be bringing people together, right? So we know that that's one of the best ways. It is hard to build social cohesion in a virtual environment. So as you think about what are the times and the causes and reasons that you would bring people together in a hybrid world, things like building networking and team building are something that you would want to factor in. And finally, this fostering a sense of purpose. So we know that it is more difficult for employees to feel connected with their organization's purpose in a hybrid model. And if you think about it, that probably resonates. When you are going into the office, you're seeing things from marketing and comms that talk about the purpose. You're seeing each other. It's part of team meetings. It's resonated and it's reinforced throughout. When we're in virtual environments, we're away from all of that. So we're in our own home offices, right? We don't see that the same way. And so your connection to the purpose is heavily driven by your direct manager. And so ensuring that those managers are able to tie the work that individual employees are doing to the broader purpose is really important. I'll move on. So now we're going to talk about the spectrums of hybrid. And so when you've figured out your communications, you're starting to prepare for it, but now you're wondering, how does the rubber meet the road? What are we actually going to do here? There's a whole spectrum of ways. And I like this page because I think it depicts the spectrum of hybrid models well. But there's a lot of ways to think about it. And there are people who are all the way on one end who will say, well, everybody's going to have the same hybrid model. So we know we're going hybrid, who's going to be on site, who's going to be virtual, and everybody else is going to be 3 days a week in the office. That is one approach. And we'll talk about the other far end approach that everyone chooses in a moment. But when you do it that way, when you say everyone's going to be 3 days a week, it can absolutely work. And it, in fact, in many ways is the simplest option, right? Because it ensures that everyone is going to be on site and overlap with everybody else at least one day. What it doesn't allow for, though, are the nuances and the nuances in the roles that we do. And so you'll see there in the descriptions, everyone talks about role. And the reason it all talks about role is because it also, you don't want it to come into individual biases either. You want to really think about what the roles need to be productive. So McKinsey has done a ton of research into this. Our McKinsey Global Institute has worked for years looking at automation and how things are changing in that nature to really understand at what point do you start losing efficiencies if you're virtual? Because theoretically, anything with a digital output could be virtual. But at what point is it not as efficient? And this gets into the, just because we've been doing it. So we now know things can be done virtually, but are they being done as well? One of the examples I like to bring up on this one is just your basic learning and development programs, right? So we can do them virtually, and we are, and they're good. But I think if you ask anyone, they will also say, yeah, but there's something about being in person when you're learning something, or being apprenticed, or being mentored. Those are things it's a different skill set that takes to do those well in a virtual environment. We also actually just know that there's a magic there of being in person, and you lose that efficiency in the virtual world. So thinking through the activities that any individual role does and what is required for them to actually be effective will start to help you figure out what the right models are. And it's not likely that it's the same across the board, right? So if you're in finance, for example, you may not need to be in the office every single day. Your work may not involve that level of mentorship or creative collaboration across functions every single day. There may be more heads down work involved, but probably once a month or once a quarter when you're closing out books and you have questions and things like that, it probably does make a lot of sense to come together, right? So it may make more sense for you to come together in sprints for a week at a time, as opposed to coming in 1 day a week every week. So thinking through what everybody does, what their activities are, and what will be the most effective can be a really helpful way to actually get down to a nuanced approach. It does also mean that you're going to have to invest in scheduling software and think about your space design and all of that as well. But getting to that, the other end of the spectrum is allowing ultimate flexibility for everybody. So saying, you choose your working model. And there's something that's very appealing about that in terms of empowering our employees and empowering our managers, letting our managers manage or letting our leaders lead, I've heard clients say. And that's wonderful, but there's a lot of risk involved. So one of those risks is you come in because you need to collaborate and nobody else is there. So it really starts to undermine the magic of being together if every time you come in, you can't find the people that you need to work with, nobody's there, it's empty. It also lends itself to a lack of structure, which means that we all remember those meetings pre-pandemic in which, 3 people were in person and 2 people were on the phone, or maybe more. And the people on the phone never quite understood what the people in person were saying, and you were constantly asking them to move the phone speaker so you could hear better, and you're losing the side conversations, and you start to feel left out. And so that could then, change the tides of when you're coming in and things like that, but it's hard to actually deliver on that level of flexibility for everybody effectively. So instead of doing that, think about bringing your employees in from the beginning, right? So how are we going to do this together? Understanding what your employees want and figuring out how to balance that with what your business needs. So understanding what the roles are that they're performing, what they need in order to be truly efficient, truly effective, and finding the right balance there. Determining what the moments that matter, right? So determining when you really need to be in person. So do you really need to be in person to do more of the routine work? Probably not. But are there specific meetings that are really critical or specific times in a team's lifespan? So thinking through something like bringing a new team together that's never worked together before. We know that there's something about building those bonds in person that's really helpful. Does that mean that for the next 6 to 12 weeks that they're working on this project, they need to be together in person every day? No. But investing a little bit more in-person time in the beginning can be helpful. So setting some of those guardrails, essentially. These are the reasons why we would come into the office, why we would be in person, and allowing people to work with those can be a way to start to do that. And it can help you to figure out how you're actually going to be able to drive team and individual productivity effectively. Finally, thinking that what got us here will get us there. So we've been remarkably successful over the past year. I think we have been more successful than anyone truly thought possible going into the pandemic and working from home. And I say that because if we actually thought that it was possible to be as successful and productive as we were over the past year, we would probably have had more than about 30% of companies having formal telecommuting policies on their books prior to the pandemic, but we didn't. And it probably wouldn't have been the number one ask, but flexibility, because we would have already been there. So knowing that we didn't think that, knowing that we've been wildly successful now, it's very easy to think, okay, great, then we don't really need to change anything, right? This is going to keep working. Unfortunately, that's probably not true. It could be, but generally what we've seen is that when companies go virtual, they actually tend to be quite successful for about the first 1 to 2 years, and then they start to see the fissures form. They start to see the culture break down. They realize they haven't apprenticed their incoming classes, their younger talent the same way. And that's when they all end up coming back to the office. Or often end up coming back to the office. So what I would say is it's important to think about those capabilities now. Thinking about what you're going to need to actually sustain things going forward. We talk a lot about the generational differences, and there's generally an assumption that it's our Gen Z or digital natives that are going to want to be totally virtual and living on the beach in Tahiti with their laptop, and that it's our baby boomers or our older generations that are going to want to be back in the office the way that they were before. It turns out that's not really what we've seen. When we've done surveys, we found that it's really about a third. So the one thing that stands out is that the generation that is most excited about being in office, or least excited rather, about being fully virtual, it's actually our Gen Zers. So what they're realizing when we've done interviews with folks is that they need the mentorship, they need the apprenticeship, and they're not getting it in the virtual world the same way. They need to be able to make a name for themselves. So when we think about all of that, we realize there are some capabilities that truly aren't there. And it's not necessarily about the technical capabilities that maybe we can train for virtually. A lot of it is about kind of the meta things, right? The adaptability, the resilience, and actually just seeing people in working models, right? So what you need to do now is, instead of just kind of hoping that we can kind of continue to grit through it, is actually starting to identify what those critical new skills are. So that adaptability, the flexibility, the ability to learn and change paces more quickly, the agile skill set, if you will. Identifying those new skills, and then starting now to test and iterate so that you actually know how you're going to train for them going forward, getting people into the pipeline for trainings. And finally, we have act like a small company to have a big impact. So small companies are much more effective in many ways of acting in that agile manner, right? Of changing things quickly. And if you want to really start now, when truly we'll probably be in these hybrid models in the next few months, you're going to need to act really with a lot of agile, right? You're going to need to start bringing people in to pilot things and see what works, build their capabilities. Start with managers, right? Across all functions, you know that your managers are going to need additional skills to lead virtually or lead a hybrid model. So it's a good place to start. Finally, just kind of wrapping things up here, but the 5 things that we said on the last few pages in order to avoid those pitfalls: use your change management lens, prepare for a hybrid future, embrace that there is not a one-size-fits-all approach, do it together, and invest for tomorrow today. So when I say to use a change management lens, it's going to be a big transition. This, in fact, is going to be one of the biggest transitions that most of your workforces have gone through, that coming back to the office. Bad early experiences are going to be hard to recover from. It's not something that people can just kind of jump back into. You don't want people to leave. So think through the elements of change. Equip your coworkers and managers with the right tools to shape that experience. Prepare for a hybrid future. Don't wait to start thinking about those working norms, the new capabilities, the technology processes, the policies, the real estate, office design changes. There's a lot that you're going to need to think about. Start preparing now. Embrace that there's not a one-size-fits-all. So think about what the right model is going to be, right? Think about how you're going to segment your employees. And it's, you know, it's a role, it's the type of work, the activities that they're doing. It's also individual preferences. You need to bring all of that into play. Do this together. So given that your employees are the core of this, your coworkers, your employees, work with them, get their inputs from the very beginning, help them start to envision the organization's future. So when I said you need to communicate early on, this is a great way to also bring them in, right? Inspire them. This is a once in a century opportunity to reimagine how we're working. We don't want to waste it. And then finally, the invest for tomorrow today, right? So as you're preparing for those things, start testing, start piloting, start building the capabilities, start trying out new office designs, bringing in different teams for different that are on a voluntary basis, depending on how you've communicated things. But let them test different working models. See if having core collaboration hours is helpful. Different ways that you can actually provide some of that flexibility without just doing it on a day-to-day work from home, not work from home kind of. So with that, I'm happy to take questions.
Bonnie, thank you. Absolutely. It just gives a fantastic perspective on how people need to get prepared, how they need to keep thinking through the different thoughts around, all the different areas. I think you covered almost like a 360, which is nice. I have a few questions, but definitely let's take a few, and I have a few other questions which I wanted to also ask you. I think a question comes in here saying that from a point of view for people in consulting, like McKinsey or IBM and others, I think pre-pandemic, people have been traveling a lot to do the connections with the client executives or clients, right? So how's that going to evolve? And what are your thoughts around that?
So I think there's a few things there. I mean, McKinsey, as most people know, we were a kind of a 4-day a week on the ground sort of approach. And it's certainly a place that has seen significant change across all of business travel plummeted. if it wasn't entirely extinguished over the past year. So what will it look like going forward? I think many people miss the in-person interactions and the ability to actually sit next to your clients and provide the leadership and the coaching, and understand that it's not quite the same. Building those new relationships is really hard. So one of the things I talked about was figuring out what that criteria is to determine when you want to be in person. And I think that's true for consulting firms as well. When do you need to travel? When is it really important? So when you're kicking off a study, when you're just meeting a client, but do you need to actually travel for every single meeting to be in person? Do you need to travel for your, every other week touch point? Maybe not. However, if there's a really contentious decision that's going to get made and that there's a lot of stakeholder alignment that's going to need to happen in that meeting, that would probably be a meeting that would warrant traveling for. So I think we're going to need to actually feel it out a bit. There's also the question about when you're hiring new people, right? So there's the client relationship in consulting, and then there's also your team relationship and your development of your team members. And so if we know that apprenticeship and mentoring is harder in a virtual world, then would it be helpful to staff more locally, for example, so that teams can work locally together in the office a couple of days a week instead of having to travel to be together? Creating cores like that would be another approach. But you're going to want to think about when you're going to bring people together for your team development and the professional development there, and then also in order to best support your clients.
Well, thank you. No, I think you brought a great point on the interns, right? So definitely many of us have interns coming in or new grads coming in to join the workforce. They definitely, one is, I think they need to learn. I think they need to buddy up with somebody who's close to them to work, and also to learn and to understand the purpose of the organization. How do you do it? What do you need? So yeah, I think those are some of those things where some of the guardrails which you mentioned. What typically would be those specific guardrails would be? Is it like somebody having I think one is the example which you said is a local, having some local connect. If it's not, how's the buddy system going to work? Is it going to be more virtual?
So I can't say how it's going to work. I think this is one of those things that we all have to kind of commit to learning into and figuring out what works, because frankly, different things will work for different organizations.
Yes.
So I think it could be around staffing locally. I think it could be around saying in the beginning of a study, in the beginning of an engagement, we will bring people together. And so maybe it's for the first 2 weeks, we'll travel 4 days a week or 3 days a week or something like that, so we can start to build that team cohesion. And then we'll implement the kind of guardrails and criteria for when we would bring people in. And maybe during that 2 weeks, you develop some of that kind of buddy system that you mentioned, right? So those people are checking in on each other. Maybe if not all of the team is going to be local, maybe you can staff from kind of hub offices or things like that. And then thinking critically around critical times, right? So when it's the day-to-day support, you may not need to be there in person. But if it's leading up to a big meeting, again, maybe that's when you come and spend another week together.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think with people learning from people who wouldn't have learned for the past 5 years, 6 years, when things have become more, there's been a hybrid model in place, but this 1 year has completely accelerated the process of trying to get people to get into a virtual model so quick. It's amazing how people are learning to be there and be connected. You also highlighted the key thing is the purpose, right? I think communications is so critical, making sure that everybody is tied in. It's amazing.
And it's not, so the purpose is really critical in tying people back to the purpose, reminding them of how their work contributes to the broader whole. But I think the other piece, and I had said this earlier about being deliberate, everything that you took for granted is happening organically in the in-person world, in the virtual world must be done very, very deliberately. So that's everything from your check-ins, right? You're not going to see people just walking in the hallway in order to check in with how they're doing, to celebrating accomplishments. You're not even going to see people when they walk out of a meeting necessarily to know that it went well, so that you can actually be, excited with them. So how you actually plan for those, right? So how are you communicating and being really deliberate, ensuring that you're scheduling those check-ins? People get nervous, right? If I have to send you a meeting invitation to check in, I feel like I need to bring a whole deck, right? And have an agenda and be able to answer questions. But you actually just need to check in with people, right? And if you're going to do that, one tactical thing is under 20 minutes. If you put on a 15-minute meeting on someone's calendar, they're not expecting a document. They're not expecting an agenda. It signals that it's a check-in. So keeping things shorter can be really helpful. And you can do those more frequently and with more people, because networking also really hard to meet new people in the space. But you can put 15 minutes on a stranger's calendar and say, I know you just started, or I'm a new hire. You're in the space that I really enjoy, and I'd love to hear more from you, right? People have time for that, and there's lower expectations. Or things like asking how people are doing. This is one of my favorite examples. It's actually backed in science. When we ask, especially when we're virtual, and we say, hey, how are you doing? We will all say fine. 99% of us will say fine. If you're in person, you can read someone's body language, you're seeing the moods. It's easier to know if that fine is real or not real. If maybe it's covering something. That's harder to do virtually. So ask the question again. Create the space for the person to respond with a more genuine answer. So instead of just leaving it, they're fine, moving on, saying, no, but really, how are you doing? It actually then scientifically increases the likelihood that they will respond and really share.
I think that's a great tip, because it's just not, you're just doing a lip service, but you really are trying to show that you really care for folks who are in, because they're remote, you don't know, you can't personally feel it. So it's always an important piece to ask them as much as you can. Fantastic. I know. I think there are a few questions which came up on sharing the slides, but to answer the question, we're still working with Bonnie's organization, and we'll get back to you on that.
And also see, there's a question on, aside from feeling left out, what other reasons are there for working in the office when one has the ability to work from home? Seems like the benefits of working from home outweigh the negatives. There are clearly many benefits from working from home, which I think is why people are wanting this flexible model. There are reasons that people also miss being in the office. So there's feeling left out for sure. There's also the that opportunity for apprenticeship that we talked about. So, and I think this is actually why we saw that difference between our Gen Zers and our older, more experienced colleagues. And if you knew what you're doing, everybody knows you, you can pick up the phone and call the other, N-1 kind of executive and work things out really easily. It makes sense to work from home. There may be more benefit there. However, if you need to be apprenticed, if you need to learn, it's really important to be in person, right? There was a study that was done that was looking at new hires and their success rate. And they looked at all of the different potential variables, right? To see, is it which location they're starting in? Is it if they have these degrees, if they went to this school, if this was looked at all different things to try to figure out what was the best predictor of these new hire success. And the best predictor was who their buddy was. So not even who their buddy was, sorry, it was who they sat next to. So the person that they sat next to in the office, they actually kind of subconsciously were mimicking, right? So if you put them, if this is in sales, if you put them next to the best salesperson on the floor, they started picking up what they were doing. They heard the way they were interacting on the phone, in the video conferences. They started picking up those kind of tips and tricks, even without being told or being matched with them. If you put them next to someone who is mediocre, it was the same thing. So especially early on in our careers, there's a lot of benefit from being in person that we need to kind of balance out. There's also, if you think about sensitive conversations, right? That's another thing that you might want to be in person for, right? To help manage those feelings and emotions. For negotiations, it is hard to negotiate with someone when you can only see them from the chest up. You can't tell if they're fidgeting. You can't tell if they're nervous, right? There's things that we all know that you want to be able to read in a negotiation situation. If it's something that there's just a lot of anxiety around, because it's a really big, ambiguous decision that you all have to wrestle with, that's another thing that's really helpful to have people in person to do, right? Whiteboarding. There's a lot of different solutions out there, and some people are really, really great at virtual whiteboarding. Many of us are not.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you brought up another great point on this unconscious bias. It's a different dimensions, but this is one more additional dimension of looking at somebody who's virtual versus where somebody is actually in person. So how do you treat, right? So it's just definitely you got to be treating the same and have the same level of effort. It's absolutely, people forget that, and I think there have been people changing their mindset on you being a person being from a virtual to somebody is being remote, right? So people used to look at, hey, I don't know what the person is doing who's remote, right? So, but definitely the approach has changed. There's been a huge mindset. However, I think everybody needs to start looking at. But the case is different when you're in a manufacturing scenario versus, when people who can be remote. Yeah, they could definitely be be able to give their absolute outcome and productivity. And I think the productivity even went up, which we have seen with everybody being low at their homes.
I see there's a question about how I was promoted when I am so young. I appreciate that. I am not that young, actually, is the answer to that. It's just helpful lighting.
Really. Thank you. Any? Please send in your questions if there's any. I think as the questions come in, I think one other thing is, which I wanted to also ask, is the water cooler movements, right? So today you can't do that. It's more. It can't be done. Mostly it's physical, right? So, but people have started creating those virtual water cooler movements. Some smaller groups getting in and saying, okay, let's chat about it. But yeah, it's how safe it is, right? So so those are some of those questions which keep coming up, right? Is it really safe? Because you being virtual, it's on a device or a tool. It's quite interesting on how that dynamic shapes out.
Absolutely. I think especially in the beginning of the pandemic, people were very nervous about it, right? Is this being recorded? Can I not see something? I think people have gotten more comfortable with it, but that doesn't mean that it makes it as genuine. There's still kind of a distance that happens even over video conference. But one thing that I would think about is, and especially as we're moving into that hybrid world, right, is thinking about when you are using video conference, when you are using telephone, when you are using in person, when you are using email, chat, etc. There's a lot of different channels for communication. In fact, channels that we didn't previously use for business communication frequently, we are now using, right? Slack or WhatsApp or even video conferencing. Many organizations did not regularly use video conferencing prior to the pandemic. What we did was we all switched to video conference, and we took every single email and every single meeting and every single phone call and we put them all in video conference. I would think about what are the criteria that you want to set in place for your organization for when to use each kind of device. Because by putting everything on video conference, we chained ourselves to our laptops even more so than we were before. So before, when you could take a phone call and you could go for a walk, can't do that anymore. So think through that. And as you're thinking through that, you'll start to create more space in the day. And that will allow for some of those more casual connections, right? When you could actually just pick up the phone and call someone to check in with them and have a water cooler moment that way, as opposed to depending on video conference for everything. Similarly, thinking about actually just how you're scheduling, right? So I think everyone has experienced to be like, well, this ends at noon and the next thing starts at noon. So I'm going to be either ending one a minute early or getting into one a minute late, and it gets really complicated. I think to address that, there's a big movement to say 25 is the new 30, 50 is the new hour. And this is one of my other favorite tips or tricks. We all did that by saying, well, this meeting is going to go from 9 a.m. to 9:25 or 9 a.m. to 9:50. We also all know that nobody has scheduled another meeting to start at 9:25 or at 9:50. So because of just human behavior, we go till 9:30 or we go till 10.
No, it's definitely. I've started seeing that in my organization because a manager sets it up, and I think I said, "Why is it so?" And now you can really feel that you need to really have that gap, or at least the 10 minutes to get prepared for the next one, or take a break. Right? You definitely want to take a break. Otherwise, either it's a Zoom fatigue or the Teams fatigue. It's just creeps in pretty quickly when you're kind of moving between calls back to back. And and these meetings just don't, and you really, by the end of the day, you just really feel
exhausted. So the trick is to take it from the top. So instead of scheduling the meeting from 9 till 9:25, start it at 9:05. You will have people that will join at 9 because they just didn't read the invite correctly. But the expectation is when they realize they're the only ones, then they'll say, "Oh, this doesn't start till 9:05. Actually, can you grab a drink of water?" And they'll be very appreciative of that. So taking the 5 to 10 minutes off the top, instead of hoping that you'll end early at the bottom, will allow you to still end where we're kind of all trained to end, at the half-hour mark or at the top of the hour. But it will still give you that break between.
Amazing. Thank you. No, I think it's a great tip. Absolutely. I think we have 10 minutes. So if there's no questions, I think I don't see any questions. Just give a minute. I did see another question here.
So how can teams create psychological safety so individuals can share their authentic feedback on preferences? Often they know they are the only ones who want remote and struggle to voice the perspective. What strategies do you recommend for measuring results? Okay, two separate questions. So on the psychological safety. So one of the things that's helpful is sharing some of the data, because they're probably not the only one who wants remote, or at least wants hybrid. Given the surveys that we have done, the majority of people actually want to have more flexibility. You can also do things anonymously. You can work with a partner to survey folks so that it can be kept confidential. But I think there's a broader question there, right, around psychological safety in your organization as a whole. Because if you're not feeling safe enough to voice your preferences around working models, you may also not be feeling safe enough to voice your preferences around a host of other things as well, or take the risks that are necessary, or make the mistakes that maybe are necessary in order to iterate rapidly and push the envelope in the way that you're thinking. So there's, and part of that is around that capability building that I mentioned too. The ways that we may have created psychological safety in the old world and in the in-person world are a little bit different than the things that we might consider doing in a virtual or in a hybrid environment. But being, as a leader, as a manager, being open and sharing things. So if you can lead by example for your teams and be vulnerable, that can help others feel that they have the permission to. That ask twice rule that I mentioned as well. Some of those are some of the kind of smaller things, but obviously there's a lot to think about there, and a lot of training that you're going to want to do to create that space. And it's important to know whether or not you have the space when you're in person. So if you didn't have it in person, it's pretty unlikely that you're going to have it virtually, and even more unlikely that you'll have it when you go hybrid. So
no, I think that's absolutely right. So there's another question here, which I say is with expansion of virtual work, impactable implications on residency or relates to personal taxation. I think probably it's more a CPA question, I guess, but I think it's context of this is similar to 2 decades ago There's a move towards e-commerce and online software downloads, which cause several questions and change clarifications on taxation. So, not sure if.
So what I would say is yes, depending on what country you're in, depending on what state you're in, depending on what city, like there are absolutely implications for working not virtually necessarily, but working remotely. And that's one of the things that we actually like to talk about sometimes is there's a difference between saying that a job can be done virtually and a job can be done remotely. So virtually could actually still imply that you're quite near each other, that you're still in the same location, whereas remotely says you can work anywhere. So do you need to create some guardrails? And for many organizations, you will want to put some of those in place because you're going to want to think about what the tax implications are. I am not the right person to ask about the tax implications. I did not go to accounting school, but it is something that I would suggest to all my clients that they bring in their accounting departments and as well as legal, because there can also be changes in HR policies and things like that.
Probably it's not even the taxation as well. I think probably labor laws from whichever country you are in. I think that also applies, I guess, right?
So from a country to country, for sure. But there are tax differences, even like state to state in the US. So I know like when I file my taxes, I have to have how many days I spent in every state, and because there's state taxes that change. Becky asked a second question on what strategies you recommend for measuring results as opposed to time in office for knowledge workers. So I think that this question is kind of getting down to productivity, which was such a big question in the beginning of the pandemic. I think every conversation I had was, well, but how do I know people are being productive? And the question I always like to ask is, well, how did you know that they were being productive before? Because time in office is not necessarily a great indicator of how productive someone is. So it's about thinking about how are you setting goals, right? And tangible goals, and establishing, your KPIs so that you can measure against those. If you have a new team and you're just starting to work together, setting micro goals so that you have more deliberate check-ins without micromanaging and constantly asking what they're doing and what they're working on. If you can put in those micro goals, it will facilitate those check-ins, and you can understand if people are kind of falling off the timeline that would be expected. And is there usually a cost savings or increase for the organization to have people work from home? So we would anticipate that there would be a savings depending on how you handle real estate. We also probably would not suggest that you go and sell off all your real estate right now, because this is something that we need to learn into. So you're going to need to think about things. And there's going to be some upfront investment that's required as well in terms of how are you redesigning your office. If we think about the offices that we left, they are designed for individual work. If you think about the reasons why you're going to want to bring people back to the office in the future, it's for collaboration, right? So you're going to need to think about changes to your office design, which will require some investment. But over the longer term, if you're not bringing everybody together on a weekly basis, you may not need the same kind of real estate footprint that you had before. So there's that savings. If you're a business, that travels, like consultants and things like that, if you're not traveling as frequently, there's definitely going to be significant savings there to be had. You also want to think about what you're providing to your employees in the work from home setup. So I'm looking kind of overall at all of the benefits as well. But if you're, providing stipends for Wi-Fi, or you're providing maybe a one-time setup reimbursement so they can set up their home offices, get ergonomic chairs and things of that nature. I bought a lot of whiteboards, lots of whiteboards in my home office now. But those are some of the kind of things that you're going to want to think about, that kind of upfront outlay, and then think about how you're going to change things longer term.
Absolutely. I think we are 5 minutes into over the hour, so I think I don't see any questions. First of all, really thank you. Absolutely, this is a fantastic session. This is a session which is needed for the hour, because everybody is looking for what's the way to look forward. Bonnie, thanks for bringing in all the different perspectives. What's the pitfalls? Appreciate your time, and help having everybody else to listening through, and we also got great questions today. Thank you, everyone. Yes.
Can I answer one more question that I just saw come through? Sorry.
Yes.
This is about having more meetings because casual discussions have all become meetings, as I was saying, because that's kind of the only way you can interact with each other. And how do you actually just ensure people have time to get work done? I think it's a great question. When we think about flexibility, one of the ways we've been talking about it the most is about just where you're working from, right? So the flexible working model of in office or not. However, there's a lot more to flexibility than that. And there's actually your working hours, right? So if you can think about setting some kind of boundaries as an organization and saying something like, these are our core meeting hours, or these are our cross-functional meeting hours, or individual meeting hours. And then establishing outside of those core collaboration hours, the flexibility for individual heads down time.
Yes.
That can be really an effective way to ensure that you're not just spending 12 hours a day or 8 hours, whatever it is, in back-to-back video conferences.
No, absolutely. You need that time, your me time to take care of things, what is needed.
Well, and just to get work done, right? I used to have a client who we had all of these meetings, and at the end of a day of all of these meetings, she would look at me and she would go, meetings aren't the actual work. And I'd be like, yes, I know. I will be going back to my hotel room and actually doing the work for you. So it's important to allow for the individual heads down focus time, right? And if you can establish as a working norm across your organization what those hours are, you'll be a lot better off because people will respect it more. Whereas currently it's kind of open season on scheduling meetings.
Great. Thank you, Bonnie. Thanks for taking that. I think it's absolutely great. So before we wrap up, I think I have a few of the closing comments. So Indo-American Community Services is supporting organizations for the COVID-19 support in India. I think you all have heard. I think there's a lot of chaos and people working towards that. So there are 3 different organizations which IACS is supporting, which is Give India, Seva International, and India Development Relief Fund. So these are the 3 organizations which we are supporting. Please go ahead and support them and do any kind of donations so that the needy can really benefit from here, from all the medical support which these organizations are providing. So we also want to thank our corporate sponsors today: ITW, Dover Corporation, USG Corporation, Nordson, Sunoco, ChampionX, and we also have other supporting corporations like McKinsey, Voya Financials, Verizon Media, Conagra, SLR US, Aflac, Global Logic. So with that, I think we have an upcoming session at 3 CST Central or 4 Eastern. This is our keynote from Niren Chowdhury. He's the CEO of Panera Bread, and this is on the top leadership in the new normal, right? So it's going to be definitely exciting session. We're looking forward for that. So feel free to join here and register if you haven't. It's just a click. If you go to iacsinfo.org, you will find this session. And then you can go register and please join. It's an exciting session. We're looking forward. And I think we are on top of the hour. Thank you everyone for joining, and thanks for all the questions. And hope you really enjoyed Bonnie give her the perspective on the future of work.